In this video, we're going to look at operations with complex numbers. So before you start this lesson, just make sure you're comfortable with what is a complex number when you have that I in your expression, and also remember how to FOIL. So the first thing we're going to look at is every complex number can look at this form, a plus bi. So we call this the real part and this the imaginary part because it's next to that I. That's not super important. Just know that generally there's like a whole number and a part with an I that go together with your complex numbers. All right, so a complex number actually has two numbers involved. All right, so adding complex numbers is just a matter of combining like terms. If you imagine this exact same scenario where we had x's instead of i's, oops, that should be an x. You can only combine like terms. So I can only combine the two things that have an x together, and I can combine the two numbers together. But that's not going to change with the I. The I is just kind of acting as this variable. So I can combine the 2 and the 5 because those are just the numbers to get 7. And then 3i minus 4i is minus I. So I can combine the whole numbers, the real parts. I can combine the parts with the i's, the imaginary parts. All right, subtracting, the only thing you have to remember is that this complex number here is in parentheses. So this negative sign is going to distribute to both of these. So I'm going to have 5 minus I minus 3, and then the double negative with the 8 is going to be plus 8i. And then I do the same thing I did in the last example. I just combine the like terms. 5 and negative 3 can combine to give me 2. Negative I plus 8i can combine to give me plus 7i. All right, so the only real thing I want you to notice here is that if you're subtracting a complex number, just remember to distribute that into both of the terms of the complex number. All right, so here's one for you to try when you're subtracting, so be careful. I combine these two complex numbers. All right, I'll show you the solution in 3, 2, 1. And as long as you remember to distribute that negative to get minus 6 and plus 2i, then you combine your like terms and you get your final answer. All right, so when we're multiplying, we're going to start multiplying things together, and a lot of times this thing will come up, we'll get an I squared. So what is I squared? If you remember from before, I, by definition, we actually just said I is equal to the square root of negative 1. So this is the same as this. And what happens when you square a square root? The square root just goes away, and you get negative 1. So it turns out that I squared is actually just negative 1. And this is really the interesting thing about complex numbers, is sometimes the complex numbers actually just end up canceling out, and you get a real number. And that's why it's useful to introduce complex numbers, because you get these solutions, but sometimes the actual thing you end up using is still a number that makes sense. All right, so how do we multiply things? We've done this before. If we're multiplying two things by two things, this is where we use FOIL. So we just have to remember the pattern of FOIL: first, outer, inner, last. So we're going to multiply the first terms together. 2 times 4 is 8. Then we multiply the outer terms together. 2 times minus I is minus 2i. Then we multiply the inner terms together. 3i times 4 is positive 12i. And then the last terms. 3i times negative I is going to be negative 3i squared. And now there's two simplifying steps we have to do to get our final answer. We have to combine like terms, so both of these terms just have a single I. And then we have to remember that I squared is negative 1. So we're going to do both of those in this next step. We're going to have 8. It's all by itself right now. Negative 2i plus 12i is plus 10i. And negative 3i squared is negative 3 times negative 1, right? I squared is exactly negative 1. Now I can actually do a little bit more simplifying, because I can do negative 3 times negative 1. That's going to give me plus 3. And I can combine more like terms, just the numbers that are left. All right, so by multiplying these complex numbers, you know it's fully simplified when you basically just get another complex number when it just has one real part and one imaginary part. All right, but as long as you're foiling and combining the terms, then you'll get down to that final answer. All right, so here's the general strategy, so you kind of have it to reference. All right, you're going to FOIL out, because we're doing two things times two things. Then we're going to replace I squared with negative 1. And then we're going to just simplify and combine all of our like terms. All right, so here's another example. Let's do it together. First, 5 times 5 is 25. Outer, 5 times 2i is plus 10i. Inner, negative 2i times 5 is negative 10i. And last, negative 2i times positive 2i is negative 4i squared. All right, and now we're going to replace I squared with negative 1. And now we're going to simplify. You'll notice that these terms in the middle, 10i minus 10i, they're just going to cancel out. And my final answer is just 29. So there's these rare cases where when you multiply complex numbers, you actually end up with something that's not a complex number. All right, here's one for you to try on your own. All right, multiply these two complex numbers together. I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. And the final answer I got was 18 plus I. So FOIL, replace I squared with negative 1, and then just combine your like terms. All right, so go ahead and practice this. The addition and subtraction should be fairly simple. You're just combining like terms. Just make sure if you're subtracting a complex number, you distribute that negative. All right, multiplying, there's a couple more steps, but it's still something you've already done before. You've already FOILed before. You've combined like terms. It's just that one new thing you have to remember. Whenever you see I squared, that is just equal to negative 1. So that'll help you simplify even further.